In part 3 of the obligatory blog, I want to focus on refactoring. So I want you to take a look. If I open up index.php, which I have here, and then we also open up single.php, and I will move these to 2 panels, I want you to notice that we have a lot of duplicated code. In both cases, we are requiring functions.php. We are specifying that we want to use the DB namespace. We're trying to connect to the database, and we're running this little check to determine whether or not we could, in fact, connect. All of that's being duplicated. And you can imagine for every new file that we create, would we have to do this again? That seems really wasteful, because what if we change maybe the namespace? Well, then we would have to update this in every single location. Or what if we decide rather than dying, we want to throw an exception or redirect somewhere? Well, now because we are repeating ourselves, which we shouldn't be, we would have to update that in every location. So let's do this. Let's create a new file for our app, and I'm going to call it blog.php because this is what our app is. It's a blog. So now, within blog.php, I will require everything that we need for our project. So we bring in functions.php. We try to connect to the database. And by the way, I'm going to bring this back to 1 panel for now. Next, if I go back to index.php, we will need to hold on to that, but now we can simply replace this with require blog.php, and now we're going to use blog. All right, and that's a lot cleaner. So now, when the page loads, the first thing we do is we bring in our functions file, we connect to the database, and if we couldn't, we die in this case. And then at that point, we can do more specific queries, such as grabbing all of the posts. Next, I want to do the exact same thing. So I will just copy this right here and paste it in. And then once again, I can get rid of all of that code. So the next thing is to make sure that it's still working as we would hope. Now, if I run this, we're going to get this error. We could not call db connect. And that's because within here, we also need to specify that we're using blog/db. Let's save that, run it. Now it's working. Or, alternatively, in this case, we're only using it once, so why don't we just specify the full path, blog db connect. Run it, and now that's working. Let's go to single.php, and now it's working exactly as it did before, but this time we're not having to duplicate all of this code. We're not having to connect in every single occurrence. Good. The next thing I want to do is what we talked about at the end of the previous lesson. If I switch over to single.php, we had this bit right here where we get a specific post by ID. And as you can imagine, that's not ideal because this is a blog. It's something that we would use frequently. So if that's the case, we should create a reusable function so that we can use it throughout our project. And then also, in addition to that, it will make this page more readable. Rather than having to decipher the SQL query, we simply can run post equals db/get by ID, and then we pass in the ID like so. And then if we want, we can cast whatever is in the query string to an integer. Let's go ahead and create our abstraction. So I'm going to remove all of that, come back into functions.php, and in the previous lesson, we created the skin for this, and I said for you to try to implement it yourself. Now we're going to do it together. I'm going to begin by pasting in that line right there. So we run db query, select star from post where ID equals ID, limit 1, and now rather than grabbing the superglobal, we're going to reference the ID that was passed in there. Also, we need to have a reference to the connection, so that should be supplied as well. If I come back, let's make sure that we include that. Good. So now we run the query and we store it within posts, and now if I scroll down, we can simply return post. But in these cases where we're not doing anything else, it's just as easy to run this right here, return, and then our query like so. Let's also clean things up so it's a little more readable. We're going to store each of these on their own line like so. There we go. So now when the user calls the getById function, they pass the ID of the row they want, we query the database, and then we return the results. And that will either return the results right here, or it'll instead return false. So now it's much easier to understand. We call db getById, and now we have this new abstraction that's easy to read. The final thing is we once again run if there is a post, then we set it to the first item, we specify the view path, and then we include it. All right, let's see if that worked. Reload, and we are getting this error called undefined function blog db/db. So clearly, we made a quick mistake in functions.php. Let's come back in 52, and of course, because we've already set this file as the db namespace at the top, we can remove that entirely. Now if I reload, it's working just as it did before, but we've added some more convenience functions. The next thing I want to do, if I go back to single.php, is tackle how we are creating views. I still think this is a little sloppy. In index.php, we see that we do the exact same thing. We set the view path, then we include views layout. It's not ideal. So let's fix this. I'm going to go back to functions.php, but let's think about this. It's called functions.php, but we've namespaced this as the db namespace. So why don't I rename it to db.php? And it's also a good convention for your namespaces and your subnamespaces to be mimicked within your folder structure. So within this project, you would have a blog folder, and within it, you would have a db namespace, and you would have any nested folders that you need. In this case, though, it's a really simple project, and I'm not going to worry about that. But good, so now we have our db class. Now I should create another traditional functions.php file, and this will simply be for regular functions that we would use. So I'm going to create a new view function. And what this should do is accept a path as well as any data that the user wants to send through to the view. But I'm not going to require any data, so I'm going to set that value to null. So let's come back to index.php, and I'm going to copy and bring this in just so we can look at it for reference, like so. So we see the first thing we need to do is set the path. So we will say include, and we're going to go into the views folder. We want to specify the user's path. So if the user calls it and they say load single, that means that we need to load the file that's called single.view.php within the views folder. So let's load that .view.php. Even though it's not required, I find it's a little more readable if I surround it with braces. And it's still going to interpret that variable, but it gives me a little signal that, hey, this is a variable, not a string that I'm working with here. The final thing is to take care of any data that the user passes. If I back up, what if we have this data array and we want to send that through to our view? Well, I'd like to be able to do it like this. So let's do this. If data, then we're going to use a new function that you may not have learned yet, extract. So what this is going to do is assume that I have this array. And we could say name, it's an associative array, is Jeff, age, and I am 27. When we run extract, I believe I have taught you this. When we run extract, what that's going to do is it's going to take all of these items out of the array and make them available as simple variables. So after running extract, we would have name equals Jeff and age equals 27 in this case. So it's very helpful specifically for working with views and such. So we are saying if data was provided, let's extract that data and then include the file that the user specifies. Good. So now we have our new functions file. We're including it there, but we also want to make sure that we require the db.php file as well. Now, if I go back to index.php, we can clean this up. I'll get rid of the comment, and now I'm simply going to run view, and we want to load the index view. I also want to pass through some data. So let's pass through this array, and this is simply one way we could do it. Posts equals posts. Another way you might see it if you work with frameworks is they will often create a new data array, like that, and then you would say data posts equals some posts that you would fetch, then you could fill everything else up, and then you load your view, and you pass through the data like so. In this case, though, we don't really have much to work with, so I'm simply going to do it like so. Now I can remove all of this entirely, and let's see if we did it as expected. I will come back, go back to the home page, and take a look. It's still working. Now we need to go to single.php and do the same thing. I'm going to copy that just for convenience and get rid of all of that right there. And now we're going to load the single view, and this time I'm going to pass through post, like that. One more time, click on PHP isn't too hard, and now we're getting the exact same effect, but now we've refactored our code considerably. And that's all we're going to do for this lesson. So for a recap, what we've done is we've created a new functions.php file. And what we did with the old code is we renamed it as db.php because this should only be for functions related to working with our database. Our functions file now has a new helper function called view that will take care of including our views for us. And that way, it's much easier to load any view that we want. We can also pass through data. So let's say I want to pass through a name as well. We could say name equals John Doe. And now within the index.view.php file, we have a new name variable to work with. And we'll say the blog by name. I will go back, and now you'll see that we have passed that value through. So that's a very clean way. And what I want you to pay attention to here is that we have this separation of concerns. So I have my view, and other than filtering through, for example, an array, it's not doing any work. It's not doing any logic. It's not connecting to a database. It's not performing any extensive calculations. A view is stupid. You just give the view some data, and it presents it on the page, but it is not the brains of the operation. The controller is really the brains of the operation. And in this case, our index file and our single file are serving as the controllers. Now, the next thing that we did was we created another helper function, getById. Because it's a blog, we will often want to grab posts according to a specific ID. So when you think, hey, this is something I would use frequently in my project, that's when you need to create reusable functions. And now if there's another file in our project and we need to grab a post by the ID, it's as simple as calling a single function and passing in the ID and the connection. And here it looks like we have a small indentation problem, but that's fine. And okay, that's going to do it for this lesson. If you have any questions at all, just leave a comment underneath this video, or of course go to the tutsplus.com forums and I'll be glad to help you out. My name's Jeffrey Way, and as always, I'll see you in the next lesson.